They ripped my dress before the gala, laughing as if it were a joke, their voices sharp with cruelty. You won't show up now. I can still hear the sound of fabric tearing, not just silk, but a piece of me, an intimate humiliation performed with careless hands. That moment has stayed in my chest like a shard, and even though months have passed, I can feel the jagged edge whenever I breathe too deeply. I am 74 years old now, living in a quiet apartment above a bakery that smells of warm bread in the mornings and burnt sugar at night. And if anyone asks me who I am, I find it hard to answer, because most of my life I have been defined in relation to others, someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's grandmother, and rarely my own name spoken with weight. But what happened that night, in the hours before the gala, forced me to look at myself without disguise and to admit that I was not invisible, not disposable, not the afterthought they wanted me to believe I had become. You see, when you are an older woman in a family that prizes appearance, youth, and presentation above sincerity, you learn to shrink yourself, to nod when they correct you, to laugh at jokes that are not kind, to accept being placed at the edges of photographs or sometimes erased from them entirely. My daughter-in-law has always been skilled at this performance of control, her eyes scanning a room like a director, her smile tight and sweet for outsiders, but sharp as glass for me. She was the one who insisted I attend the gala, as if including me would prove to others what a generous and modern daughter she was, caring for the old woman in her husband's family. I had doubts, of course. I had heard too many whispers about how I dressed too loudly, how my laughter was embarrassing, how my body no longer fit the image they wished to present. But I accepted her invitation because I still wanted to believe there was a place for me, even if it was a place in the background. I prepared with care, because preparation is a form of dignity. I took the gown I had saved for years, the one I had bought on a trip to Florence when my husband was still alive, when we believed in anniversaries and celebrations, when I still thought the future had wide doors. It was deep blue, silk that caught the light like water at dusk, a dress I had never dared to wear because every occasion seemed either too small for it or too crowded with people who would not notice. I kept it wrapped in tissue paper at the back of my closet, waiting for the night when I would feel allowed to appear. When she said the word gala, something in me rose, and I thought, perhaps this is the moment. Perhaps they will see me not as a burden, but as a woman who still knows beauty. I spent the afternoon getting ready, slowly, deliberately, the way a ritual is done when it matters. I pinned my hair carefully, touched a little powder to my face, opened the velvet box where the necklace from my mother still rested, though I had not worn it in decades. I placed the diamonds against my skin for a moment, and then removed them, thinking, not yet, perhaps later, perhaps when the time is right. It felt too bold, too radiant, and I have been trained all my life to dim my own light for others. Then, as I stood before the mirror adjusting the silk over my shoulders, she came in. Her smile was already rehearsed, her voice pitched in that falsely casual way that hides intent. She circled me like a tailor, but with none of the tenderness, adjusting the fabric with unnecessary force, her fingers tugging as if the dress were a rival to be subdued. My son lingered at the doorway, silent, his eyes avoiding mine as though watching would implicate him in something he did not want to acknowledge. And then it happened. The sharp, deliberate pull, the sound of fabric splitting, the gasp that escaped my throat before I could silence it. She laughed immediately, that brittle laugh of hers, and said, "Oh, how clumsy. I suppose you won't show up now." Really, it's for the best. You'd only feel out of place. My son did not move. He did not defend me, did not protest, did not even look shocked. He simply shifted his weight and muttered something about the car being ready. That was the moment, the exact second, when I understood with full clarity that I was not just excluded accidentally, not just overlooked out of thoughtlessness, but actively erased, deliberately diminished. They wanted me not there, not visible, not remembered. I sat down heavily on the chair by the window, clutching the torn silk in my lap, my heart pounding like an old clock forced to run too fast. They left soon after, her perfume trailing behind like smoke, his silence heavier than any insult. I heard the front door close, the car start, the fading sound of their departure, and I sat there alone in a half-ruined gown with the taste of shame bitter in my mouth. It is a peculiar pain, the pain of being told without words that your presence is not wanted, that you embarrass the very people you gave your body, your labor, your youth to. I wanted to cry, but the tears would not come. I wanted to scream, but my voice stayed locked in my throat. Instead, I folded the torn fabric carefully, as if preserving a relic, because that was what it felt like. A sacred injury. As night fell outside the window, I stared at my reflection, the ruined dress, the tired face, the lines etched by years of service, compromise, silence. I thought of my mother, who had once told me in a moment of anger and love, "Do not let them dress you in shame. Wear your wounds as embroidery. Make them art, not chains." At the time, I had dismissed it as a strange saying, but now it returned with startling clarity, and I realized she had been preparing me for this very moment, when my worth would be questioned not by strangers, but by my own blood. I sat there, 74 years old, abandoned in a room meant to humiliate me, and instead of crumbling into the role they had written, I began to feel something stir, something I had not felt in years, something close to defiance, something close to life. I remained seated long after they had gone, listening to the silence of the house, a silence that was not peace, but vacancy, a silence that felt curated for me, like a cage without bars where they had placed me, so I would not interfere with the show. They were about to stage at the gala. For some time, I told myself that perhaps she had been careless, that maybe the dress had torn by accident, that maybe tomorrow there would be apologies and explanations. But even as I tried to invent excuses for them, my body knew the truth. Because cruelty has a distinct taste, metallic and bitter, and once you have swallowed it, you cannot pretend it was sugar. I thought about the car engine fading into the distance, about the sound of their laughter in the hallway, about the way my son's eyes avoided mine, and I knew with certainty that this was no mistake, no slip of the hand, no accident of fabric. This was a decision, and decisions carry intention, and intention carries meaning. They wanted me to stay behind. When I could finally stand, my knees stiff from sitting too long in stillness, I went to the bathroom and looked at myself under the harsh light. The tear in the dress was not catastrophic, only a jagged line near the waist where the silk had given way. But it was enough to make the gown unwearable in polite company, enough to make me hesitate, enough to humiliate. I traced the rip with my fingers and felt something raw rise in my chest, a mix of grief and fury that had nowhere to go. I washed my face, dried it with the rough towel, and sat on the edge of the tub, waiting for tears that still refused to come. I thought of all the years I had waited in other rooms for them, in kitchens while they finished their conversations, in cars while they finished their calls, in guest rooms while they laughed downstairs. And I realized this waiting was not new. It was simply sharper, clearer, impossible to disguise. It was almost 8 when the phone rang. I knew without looking that it was her, calling not to check on me, not to see if I was hurt, but to leave a message of performance, a line of concern rehearsed for an audience that was not me. I did not answer. The machine picked up and her voice filled the room, light, casual, dripping with false sweetness. "Martha, we're just arriving. Everything's so busy. I do hope you're comfortable at home. Don't worry about tonight. It's really not your scene. We'll bring you some photos tomorrow." Photos. As if proof of my exclusion could be delivered as us. Consolation. I deleted the message without listening to the end. That was the catalyst, not the ripping of the dress itself, but the recognition that the erasure was complete, that they had scripted me out of their world not with malice disguised as accident, but with conscious calculation. I could feel the weight of years of smaller acts pressing against this one moment like stones stacked into a wall. The times they told me my laughter was too loud. The times they corrected the way I told a story. The times they reminded me to wear something neutral so as not to clash with the photos. The times they called me mom in public, but never mother, as if the softer word would make me less visible. And here it was, all of it culminating in a single act of fabric torn, a single sentence of dismissal, a single ride to a gala without me. I walked back into the bedroom and sat on the chair again, the torn dress draped across my lap like a wounded creature. And I thought, this is the end of something, not the beginning. This is the line that separates what I endured from what I will know. Longer endure. I remembered my husband's funeral years ago, when my son had stood stiffly by my side, but left early because the reception was too long. And I remembered thinking even then that love had limits for him, that convenience shaped his loyalty. Tonight, the limit was me. Tonight, I had become an inconvenience so large that they had chosen to remove me altogether, like a blemish blurred from a photograph. But something unexpected stirred beneath the sorrow. In the stillness of that empty house, surrounded by the faint echo of their departure, I felt not just pain, but also a strange clarity. If they had abandoned me here, if they had torn my dress and laughed, if they had decided that my presence was a threat to their performance, then perhaps I was free, freer than I had ever been. Because once you are discarded, you have nothing left to lose, and nothing left to lose is a kind of power. I ran my hand along the silk, smooth in places, rough where it had split, and thought, perhaps this dress is not ruined. Perhaps I am not ruined either. Perhaps what has been torn can be remade into something truer. The phone rang again later that night, his voice this time, short, clipped, impersonal. "Hope you're resting. We'll talk tomorrow." We'll talk tomorrow, as if I were a child put to bed before the party, as if he still held authority over my presence, as if his words could contain me. I erased that message too. I stood at the window watching the headlights of cars slide down the street toward the city, toward the gala, toward a night of music and wine and laughter, and I thought, let them have it. Let them stand beneath chandeliers and pretend. Let them smile for the cameras. Let them speak of generosity while practicing cruelty. I will not wait here like a servant polishing silver for a table where I am not invited. That realization was the true betrayal and the true beginning. It was not just the dress that had been ripped, but the veil of illusion I had lived under. The illusion that I still belonged to them, that blood was enough to secure love, that sacrifice would be remembered. In that moment, I understood that belonging must be chosen on both sides, and they had chosen to exclude me. So I would choose differently. I would choose myself. I would choose to stand, even in torn silk, even in the shadow of their contempt. I would choose to leave the waiting room forever. The house was unbearably quiet after their departure, a kind of silence that does not soothe but gnaws at the edges of thought. And I sat there for some time, with the torn gown across my knees, unable to decide whether to place it carefully back in its box as though preserving a corpse, or to drop it into the trash where they clearly believed it belonged. And the indecision itself felt like another humiliation, because I could no longer pretend the gown was only fabric. It had become a battlefield where their dismissal had left its mark. I rose eventually and walked through the rooms, each space a museum of absence, the chairs pushed neatly into the table as though no one had ever sat in them, the glassware aligned with mathematical precision, the pictures on the wall curated to display everything but me. I had been erased from this household long before the gala, I realized, erased slowly and carefully, in ways that seemed polite to strangers, but cut me down piece by piece until the only proof of my presence was the labor of meals I cooked and errands. I ran, all invisible once performed. I returned to the bedroom and tried to distract myself with small tasks, folding stockings, rearranging the contents of my purse, wiping the already clean surface of the nightstand. But the futility of these gestures made me feel smaller with each movement, as if I were practicing the role of ghost they had written for me. I sat again and thought about the history of this erasure, how it had not begun tonight, but years earlier, when the children were small and my help was tolerated because it was needed, when I was called upon to babysit or drive or pay for what could not be afforded, when I was thanked with gifts that were not meant for me, scented candles with labels still attached, scarves chosen without thought, objects that signaled obligation fulfilled rather than gratitude felt. At the time, I told myself it did not matter, that I gave for love and not recognition. But as I grew older, I saw the pattern for what it was. They valued my usefulness but not my being. And now that my usefulness had diminished, they saw no reason to maintain the illusion. The escalation was not dramatic, not yet, but insidious in its quietness, because once the act of exclusion had been performed, its consequences rippled outward into every corner of the house, every memory I carried, every detail of my own. Reflection. I noticed how the closet space allotted to me was narrow and shadowed, while the rest of the wardrobe gleamed with her dresses in silk and satin, each hanger displaying wealth and youth like trophies. I noticed how the bathroom shelves bore no sign of my presence, no room made for my creams or perfumes, as though even my aging skincare must remain hidden. I noticed how in photographs on the mantel I was missing entirely, not by chance, but by choice, cropped out or never invited into frame. These were not oversights, I realized. They were strategies, rehearsals for the finale enacted tonight when the gown was torn and the door closed behind them. And yet, even in that isolation, I found myself remembering who I once was before their judgment narrowed me. I thought of my first job after school, standing behind the counter of a bookstore, earning too little to live on, but enough to buy the occasional second-hand dress, dresses I wore with pride because I had chosen them myself. I thought of nights with my husband, when we went dancing at community halls, when he held me as though I were radiant, when I laughed without lowering my voice for fear of being told I was too much. These memories came to me not as comfort, but as reminders that the woman they had tried to reduce into silence was once alive with color, and if she existed then, perhaps she could exist again. The night stretched long, the clock marking each hour with indifferent rhythm, and still I could not sleep. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, the cars parked neatly, the lamplight casting pale circles on the pavement, the distant sound of music from some neighbor's radio. I imagined them at the gala, her dress glittering under chandeliers, his arms stiff around her waist, both of them performing the role of benevolent hosts while I was written out of the script. And then I imagined myself there, not as they would have me, silent, background, invisible, but as I truly am, present, dignified, flawed but unbroken. The vision was faint but insistent, and it stirred something stubborn inside me. The escalation deepened when I opened the drawer of the nightstand and discovered the velvet box where my mother's necklace lay. I had hidden it away so long ago, telling myself it was too extravagant for me, that it belonged to another kind of woman, not one who cooked and cleaned and aged into invisibility. But when I touched it that night, the coolness of the diamonds against my skin, I felt a spark of defiance I had not known I still possessed. They had torn my dress, but they could not touch this. They could not erase the inheritance of resilience passed down to me through my mother's hands. I placed the necklace around my neck and looked at myself in the mirror. Even with the torn dress draped loosely, even with my hair undone, even with age marking every line of my face, I saw a woman who had not vanished, a woman who could still enter a room and command attention simply by refusing to shrink. And yet, the doubts returned quickly, like shadows reclaiming light. I asked myself whether I was being foolish, whether appearing at the gala in patched silk and old diamonds would make me a spectacle of pity rather than strength. I asked myself whether the humiliation would deepen, whether they would smirk and say I proved them right, whether the whispers would circle me like flies. These fears were real, and they gnawed at me as I paced the room, but beneath them lay another truth, stronger still. Humiliation had already been inflicted, the wound already delivered, the whispers already spoken in my absence. To appear would not create shame. It would transform it. I remembered then how often I had been told to wait. Wait in the car while they shopped, wait at the table while they conversed, wait at home while they traveled. Waiting had become my role, my prison, my identity, and tonight I understood with clarity that waiting was death in slow motion. I would not wait anymore. Even if I failed, even if I walked into that room and no one looked up, even if they laughed, it would be different because it would be on my terms, my decision, my appearance. As the hours slipped past midnight, I made my choice. Tomorrow I would not hide. I would not stay behind like discarded furniture. Tomorrow I would repair what had been torn, not perfectly, perhaps not beautifully, but sufficiently, and I would wear it with the diamonds as if both fabric and stone had been meant for that moment. Tomorrow I would walk through those doors not to reclaim their approval, for that had already been forfeited, but to reclaim myself, the self they had tried to bury beneath silence and dismissal. When I finally lay down to rest, the dress folded carefully beside me, the necklace still cool around my throat, I felt the ache of years in my bones, but also a strange new steadiness. They had escalated their cruelty by abandoning me tonight, but in doing so, they had escalated something else as well. My resolve. And that, I thought, as sleep finally touched my eyes, would be the part they never expected, the part they would never be able to control. The morning after their departure arrived, not with the freshness of new light, but with the heaviness of unfinished reckoning, and I woke as though I had not slept at all, my eyes swollen from holding back tears that never came, my body stiff from lying beside the folded dress and the necklace that still pressed faintly into my throat like a reminder that dignity, once claimed, does not easily let go. The house was already empty again, for they had left early for errands or appearances, or perhaps simply to avoid the discomfort of facing me after what they had done. And the silence was so thick I could hear the refrigerator hum like a mocking metronome marking the hours of my invisibility. I brewed coffee just for myself, poured it into a chipped cup rather than the pristine set they reserved for guests, and sat by the window, watching the street fill slowly with ordinary life. And in that ordinariness, I felt a strange sense of contrast. The world outside moved on, unaware, unbothered, while within me everything had shifted irreversibly. I looked again at the dress, at the jagged tear that ran like an insult through the silk, and I realized that leaving it folded in its wounded state would mean conceding defeat, accepting that their cruelty had achieved its aim. So I gathered my coat and placed the gown carefully over my arm, and without telling anyone where I was going, I walked to the small square of shops a few blocks away, my steps uncertain at first, my heart pounding not from exertion, but from fear of being seen in daylight after such humiliation. Yet as I walked, the winter air biting gently at my face, I felt something awaken, the rhythm of my own will, the faint but steady beat of resistance. There was a tailor's shop tucked between a florist and a shoe repair, a place I remembered passing countless times but never entering. And when I pushed open the door, a small bell chimed overhead, and the smell of fabric and dust enveloped me. Behind the counter stood a man older than me, his hands marked with the delicate scars of needles and years, and when he looked up, recognition flickered in his eyes. He remembered me, though decades had passed, because once he had altered a dress for me when I was a bride, and later he had stitched a suit for my husband when we were still building a life together. Time had thinned his hair and bent his shoulders, but his gaze was steady and kind, and when I laid the torn silk before him, he did not laugh or question or pity. He touched the fabric gently, as one touches a wound, and said only, "This can be saved." I sat in the chair near the counter as he worked, the sound of scissors and thread filling the quiet, and I thought of how rare it was to be cared for without judgment, to be seen not as a burden but as a customer, a woman bringing something of value to be restored. He did not ask why it had torn, did not press for details of betrayal, though surely he sensed something unspoken in the way my hands trembled. Instead, he hummed softly, an old tune I half remembered from another life, and in that humming, I felt my pulse slow, my breath deepen, as though the act of mending cloth might also mend the tear inside me. When at last he finished, he held it up for me to see, and though the scar of the rip remained faintly visible, the gown was whole again, dignified, ready to be worn. I thanked him with a gratitude that felt heavier than money, though I paid him from the small purse I kept hidden from my family, and as I left the shop he said, "Wear it with pride, not apology." Back at the house, I hung the dress by the window so the light could fall upon it, and I placed the necklace beside it. And for the first time in years, I looked at these objects not as relics of a past life, but as instruments of a new one. I did not yet know whether I would have the courage to enter the gala, whether my legs would carry me past their stairs, but I knew now that the choice belonged to me alone. The shift was subtle but profound. I was no longer the discarded mother left behind. I was a woman deciding whether to appear, and that decision, that freedom, was already a form of victory. As the afternoon darkened toward evening, I prepared slowly, not rushing, not performing, but inhabiting each gesture as if it were sacred. I bathed and let the water carry away the residue of shame. I pinned my hair with deliberate care. I drew a faint line of color across my lips, not for them, but for me. Because looking into the mirror and seeing myself adorned felt like reclaiming ground that had been stolen. When at last I slipped into the mended dress and clasped the necklace around my throat, I did not see a woman ruined by age or diminished by rejection. I saw a survivor of decades, a bearer of memory, a figure who had been told to stay hidden and had decided instead to shine. The house was still empty, the silence unbroken, and as I stepped toward the door, I felt a tremor of fear, but beneath it ran a deeper current of steadiness, as if my mother's voice echoed from some far place. Do not let them dress you in shame. Wear your wounds as embroidery. I touched the scar in the silk where the rip had been, and I thought, yes, this is embroidery now, a stitch of defiance, a mark of survival. And so I walked out into the night, not as an afterthought, not as a forgotten relic, but as a woman who had been told no and had answered yes. That was the midpoint of my journey, the moment when silence cracked and agency returned. And though I did not yet know what the evening would bring, I knew with certainty that I would no longer wait behind closed doors while others decided my worth. I would decide it myself, and I had decided to appear. The drive to the gala was longer than I remembered. Or perhaps it only felt that way because each passing streetlight seemed to interrogate me, casting my reflection against the window and forcing me to look at myself again and again in the mended dress and my mother's diamonds, and each time I asked whether I was fooling myself, whether courage was only another word for desperation, whether walking into that room would make me strong or ridiculous. Yet with every mile, I also felt my spine straighten a little more, because the decision had been made, and it was mine alone. And once you decide to stop waiting, the world can no longer hold you hostage. By the time the car pulled up to the venue, a grand building glowing with light and chatter spilling into the night, my hands were trembling not with fear, but with anticipation, as though I were approaching not just an event, but a reckoning that had been delayed for years. The moment I stepped out onto the pavement, the air crisp against my face, I saw them. My son and his wife stood near the entrance, greeting acquaintances with the kind of polished smiles that looked convincing to strangers, but to me were masks as transparent as glass. The instant their eyes caught sight of me, I watched the blood drain from their faces. First disbelief, then irritation, then a quick calculation of how to contain me before I disrupted their performance. She was the first to recover, smoothing her features into a smile that did not reach her eyes, striding forward with arms half raised as though to embrace me, but instead grasping my elbow with unnecessary force. "Mother, you shouldn't have troubled yourself," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for those around to hear the veneer of concern. "It's so late, and the evening is already underway." Really, you'll be much more comfortable at home. I looked at her, at the immaculate lines of her gown, at the perfect sheen of her hair, at the effort she had poured into being admired, and I thought of how much of my own life had been spent ensuring the comfort of others while mine was disregarded. For once I did not answer with politeness. I stepped past her grip, forcing her hand to fall away, and walked toward the doors. My son tried next, his voice lower, more urgent, almost pleading. "Mom, this isn't the best idea. It's a members' event, very formal. People will be watching, and you'll feel out of place. Please, don't make this harder than it has to be." I stopped just long enough to turn and meet his eyes. The same eyes I once watched light up when he blew out birthday candles. The same eyes that had avoided mine when the gown was torn. And I said, calmly, "I will feel out of place only if I let myself." His mouth opened as though to reply, but no words came, and I turned back and pushed open the doors. The noise inside washed over me like a tide. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter pitched a little too high, the rustle of expensive fabrics. Chandeliers cast golden light that reflected off polished floors, and for a moment I faltered, feeling the weight of so many eyes, wondering if they truly were all fixed on me, or if I had simply carried my fear inside. But then a small miracle occurred. A woman approached, older than me perhaps, her hair silver and her posture proud, and she smiled warmly. "You must be Mrs. Harlow," she said, pronouncing the name with respect. "I remember your contribution years ago when the foundation first began. Without donors like you, we wouldn't even be here tonight." Her words struck me with the force of revelation, because while my own family had tried to erase my place in this world, here was a stranger reminding me that it had already been recorded in the fabric of the institution itself. My name was not theirs to erase. The recognition spread quietly through the room. Another man, a board member with whom I had corresponded decades earlier, greeted me with a nod of familiarity. A program booklet listed my name among founding sponsors. It dawned on me with startling clarity that my son and his wife had not anticipated this, that they had assumed history would bend to their will, that if they erased me from their photographs, I would disappear from every photograph. But history has its own memory, and my presence tonight was not an intrusion, but a return. I walked further into the room, my heels steady against the polished floor, and the murmurs around me shifted from curiosity to acknowledgement. For the first time in years, I was not invisible. Of course, their attempts to contain me did not end at the doorway. I saw her moving through the crowd with that restless smile, whispering quick explanations into attentive ears, trying to recast me as eccentric, fragile, someone best humored rather than respected. I watched my son trail after her, shaking hands too firmly, laughing a little too loudly, as though their performance could smother the truth of my presence. But each time someone greeted me by name, each time someone recalled my earlier involvement, I felt the threads of their narrative unravel. She caught my eye across the room once, and the look she gave me was not anger exactly, but something sharper, fear disguised as disdain, because she understood that control was slipping. The escalation deepened when the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, tapping the microphone to quiet the crowd. He began to thank sponsors, past and present, listing names with the practiced cadence of someone who had done this many times before. And then, as though fate itself had conspired to puncture the story my family had spun, he paused and said, And we would especially like to recognize one of our earliest supporters whose generosity laid the foundation for what we are celebrating tonight. Please join me in thanking Mrs. Martha Harlow. The applause was not thunderous, but it was real, hands clapping, heads turning, faces smiling, and in that moment I felt the spotlight of recognition not as vanity, but as justice, as the return of something that had been withheld too long. I stood where I was, not bowing, not shrinking, but simply allowing the acknowledgement to reach me. Across the room, my son shifted uncomfortably, his face tight, while she looked down at her glass as though it contained an escape. Their discomfort was a mirror of my liberation, and I understood then that appearances, no matter how carefully curated, can shatter in an instant when truth asserts itself. They had tried to make me absent, and here I was present, visible, undeniable. Later, as the evening unfolded, I found myself in quiet conversation with a woman seated near the edge of the hall, someone perhaps in her 80s with a cane propped beside her chair. She leaned toward me and whispered, "I saw what they tried to do at the entrance. You are not the first. I was once told I was too old, too embarrassing to bring. But here we are, still standing." Her words sank into me like water into dry soil, and I felt less alone, less singular, part of a hidden sisterhood of women who had been erased and yet returned. We exchanged no more than a few sentences, but her presence was a balm. The night wore on. The music swelled, the wine flowed, and still I remained, not leaving early as they surely hoped I would, not hiding in corners, but walking through the space with calm assurance. I did not need to be the center of attention. It was enough to exist in full view. Yet each glance from my son and his wife, each whisper that faltered when I drew near, each smile that greeted me from strangers, reminded me that their power was crumbling. That was the true escalation. Not that they had tried to banish me, but that in doing so, they had forced me to reclaim myself, and now they were faced with the sight of what they had tried to bury, rising in full dignity before their eyes. When at last the gala ended and people began to drift toward the doors, I felt no fatigue, though the night had been long. Instead, I felt a steadiness I had not known in years, as though the ground beneath me had shifted from sand to stone. I walked past them without a word, without anger, without triumph even, because triumph was unnecessary. Presence itself was victory. Outside, the cold night air welcomed me like an ally, crisp and sharp, and I breathed it deeply, thinking, they may continue to plot, to whisper, to rewrite, but they can no longer deny that I showed up, that I was seen, that I remained. And that knowledge, that unassailable fact, was the escalation they had not foreseen. Not only had they failed to erase me, they had exposed themselves as people afraid of a woman who simply refused to vanish. When I returned home after the gala, I thought perhaps that would be the end of it, that the victory of simply being present would be enough to steady me and silence them. But in truth, climaxes are rarely born in public applause. They emerge in the quiet hours that follow, when the air of performance has faded and only truth remains. For days afterward, the household was brittle with silence, the kind of silence that vibrates with unspoken words. And though my son and his wife went about their routines with studied indifference, I could sense the unease beneath, the awareness that something fundamental had shifted. I moved through the rooms deliberately, not rushing, not hiding, claiming space as though it were mine by right, because it was, and each small act, pouring tea in the good porcelain, sitting at the head of the table rather than its margins, leaving the necklace out in plain view, was a declaration that the woman they had tried to erase was no longer compliant in her own disappearance. But it was not enough to live in defiance within the walls of a house where they still sought to diminish me. The true climax required more than survival. It required action, a gesture irreversible, one that would mark the boundary between the years of erasure and the years to come. It arrived almost without planning, on a morning when the mail brought a letter from the Foundation, thanking me formally for my attendance at the Gala and for my historic contributions, enclosing a photograph in which I stood at the center of a group of donors, visible, undeniable, smiling not because I had been allowed, but because I had claimed. I held that letter in my hands, and something inside me hardened into resolve. I would no longer live in their house of shadows. I would no longer be their secret, their inconvenience, their hidden labor. I would live openly, visibly, on my own terms. So I began quietly gathering what was mine: the books I loved, the photographs where I was still present, the jewelry that had belonged to my mother, the clothing that carried memories of a self they could not erase. I did not announce it, did not ask permission, because asking would have meant acknowledging their authority, and that authority had expired. When my son noticed and asked hesitantly what I was doing, I told him simply, "I am preparing to live where I am not erased." His face registered shock, confusion, perhaps even a flash of shame. But he said nothing, and in his silence I recognized again the same weakness that had allowed her cruelty in the first place. The final act came when I signed the lease on a small apartment above the bakery where the scent of bread greeted me each dawn. It was not grand, not the kind of place that would impress their circle, but it was mine, and within those walls my existence required no justification. On the day I left, I dressed not in mourning, but in celebration. The mended gown once more, the diamonds at my throat, the very symbols they had tried to use against me, now reclaimed as emblems of survival. I walked out carrying my suitcase with the steady dignity of someone who chooses departure rather than waits for exile, and I knew that though they might speak of me with disdain, though they might reduce my story to whispers of eccentricity or stubbornness, the truth was carved in stone. I had walked out by choice, and choice is power. The climax, however, was not the leaving itself, but the act that followed. I returned to the Foundation with the photograph they had sent me and offered them a donation in my own name. Modest compared to what I had once given, but enough to be acknowledged. I asked that the plaque in the entryway, long tarnished, be polished and displayed again, not hidden behind newer names. And when the director thanked me, I said clearly, "Do not thank my family. Thank me." I gave, and I still give that sentence, spoken aloud in a public office, felt like a blade cutting through years of silenced identity. It was irreversible, a statement that restored me to history and denied them the ability to rewrite it. In that moment, I felt no rage, no bitterness, only a calm clarity, as if all the years of swallowing indignities had crystallized into one unshakable truth. I exist, and my existence is not negotiable. The woman in the mirror who once doubted her worth, who thought the torn dress was a death sentence, was gone. In her place stood a woman who could wear scars as embroidery, who could enter a gala uninvited, who could walk away from the house of humiliation and into the quiet dignity of her own life. That was my climax, not a shout, not a storm, but a steady flame that could not be extinguished. In the weeks that followed, the noise of their house receded like a bad dream, and the sounds of my own life grew distinct and almost sweet. The bakery downstairs waking before dawn, with a clatter of trays and the hiss of steam. The pigeons on the ledge bickering like old men, the radiator ticking its steady reassurance. And in that modest chorus I learned a new way to measure time that did not depend on anyone else's schedule or approval. I rose early because I wanted to feel the first heat of bread through the floorboards. I walked to the tailor with a tin of tea biscuits and found him mending a hem with the same reverence he had given my dress. I brought flowers to the foundation lobby on the day they rehung the polished plaque, and when I saw my name, unhidden and unarguable, I felt neither triumph nor spite, but a quiet alignment, as if my bones had clicked back into place after a long dislocation. And returning home, I set the photograph from the gala on my small kitchen shelf, not as a trophy, but as a witness, a proof that presence once chosen does not need to shout to remain. I kept the mended dress on a wooden hanger where the light could find it in the afternoon and show the careful seam like a soft scar that had learned not to ache, and I kept my mother's necklace in its velvet box on the table by the window, not locked away as a secret of better days, but near at hand, like a tool, something useful and earned. And sometimes when the morning was gloomy or the headlines too loud, I fastened it around my throat while buttering toast at the sink, laughing at myself and loving the private ceremony of it, because I had finally understood that dignity does not belong only to ballrooms and programs and speeches. It can sit beside a chipped mug and a plate with a crack and still be whole. There were messages, of course, the kind that arrived too late and asked the wrong questions, his voice cautious and managerial, insisting we discuss practical arrangements and reputations and narratives, her voice sugar-dipped and defensive. Neither of them naming what mattered, and I answered none of it, because explanation is a cousin of permission, and I was finished with both. Instead, I wrote one letter that said everything I needed to say without inviting argument, a letter that began with my full name and ended with my forward address and the sentence I wished I had learned decades ago, that I will meet you only where I am not erased. And I walked it to the postbox myself, standing there longer than necessary to watch the red mouth close. Over it, like a final blessing, I made a habit of small freedoms, slow ones and inexpensive. The thrift store where a black wool coat waited for me like a patient friend. The library where the afternoon light made lace across the carpet, and the clerk learned my name in 2 visits. The church basement where I carried chairs for a neighborhood lecture and discovered there is a kind of strength that arrives when your arms are busy and your mind is not apologizing for existing. And on Sundays, I chose music instead of apologies, a record player found for $10 and a stack of old vinyls that remembered how to crackle. And in the doorway between my little kitchen and my little living room, I practiced standing with my shoulders open, not as a challenge, but as a promise to myself that I would never again fold into the smallest version of me so that someone else could feel taller. I do not claim that the hurt dissolved. Grief is a tide with its own stubborn calendar, and sometimes it lifts without warning. I will be slicing pears, and the memory of hands ripping silk will tilt the room. But now the tide meets a shoreline that belongs to me, and after it withdraws, it leaves small gifts I did not expect. A confidence in refusing invitations that smell of performance, a patience for quiet work, an appetite for my own company, and the understanding that love without respect is only choreography, and I am done dancing for other people's mirrors. The tailor has begun closing his shop earlier, and he jokes that I am to blame because biscuits at 3 are the enemy of industry. The baker saves me the end pieces of the country loaf because he says I bite like a soldier. The woman at the foundation front desk wears her fiercest lipstick on Wednesdays because I told her once that bravery sometimes starts in the bathroom mirror. And in their ordinary kindness, I recognize the family I was always told could be found only in blood. Perhaps blood is louder, but kindness is truer, and I have chosen to live where truth is audible. I keep one photograph from the old house, not to wound myself, but to remind myself how far the road has curved. My son as a small boy with jam on his cheek, grinning into a future he could not see yet. And when I look at it, I feel no vengeance, only the ache of a door I cannot reopen, and the clean air that comes when you stop standing in doorways that never led anywhere good. And I bless him in silence from this second-floor kitchen, with its stubborn window and its view of a crooked chimney. Not because he deserves it particularly, but because blessing keeps my own hands from hardening, and hard hands cannot hold the next life. If you are listening to me and you are where I was, sewn into someone else's story, instructed to make yourself smaller so their script is neat, then hear me plainly in the voice of a woman who has set down the tray and walked away. You are not late. You are not silly. You are not impossible. You are a door, and if they insist upon locking you, then be the keyring as well. Teach your hands the shape of refusal and your feet the route to the street. Polish your name until it is legible to you even. If no one else reads it, and when they say you will not show up, let the night open like a sleeve and walk through wearing whatever tells the truth. Even if it is a dress stitched back together and a necklace you used to think was too much. It is not too much. You are not too much. You are exactly sufficient. And the world, which is to say, the small territory you can actually touch, will meet you with bread and steam and real voices when you claim it. I do not know what I will wear next season, or whether the coat will outlast the winter, or if the plaque will tarnish again and need another cloth. But I know this with a steadiness that does not tremble anymore. I will not apologize for arriving, and I will not ask permission to remain, and if they ever again try to strip me of my place with laughter that cuts like wire, I will answer in the only language that matters now. I will answer by entering, and if there is light, I will let it find the seam and the diamonds, and if there is no light, I will carry my own.